Okay. So we have sound now. What I started to say when I started talking to myself when you couldn't hear me is that when I began to think about talking about the church and the history of the church, it's almost impossible to talk about the church and not talk about reincarnation and what happened to reincarnation and why the church didn't want reincarnation as part of the church's teachings. But I also realized I could talk for 3 hours just about reincarnation. So I'm going to just mention it very lightly and save the subject of reincarnation for another time. Actually, as far as the Romans were concerned, a lot of people don't realize that Roman occupation of the 3 provinces of Israel actually began 50 years before Joshua was born. They actually only occupied 2 of the 3 provinces, that being Judea, where Jerusalem was located, and the other one being Samaria, where Nazareth is located. And the 50 years they occupied it was consistent with their occupation of many, many other areas around the world that they called the Roman Empire. And the Romans were, in many ways, helpful to some of the countries they occupied. Countries that didn't have any armies, they didn't have to go to war with. They just literally just occupied them. And they were very, very instrumental in building roads, building bridges, and making sure there wasn't civil strife in the countries, which opened up those countries for trade with other places, and as well as to import and export goods into those areas. So in many ways it was very helpful to the Romans to these countries. But in other parts of the Roman Empire, when they had a very cruel dictator in that particular part, such as Pontius Pilate was in Jerusalem, it caused tremendous hardship and heartaches to those people. The only reason the Romans went ahead and ruled over those other parts of the world, outside of what was originally the Roman part, was because of the taxes they charged. They received tribute and taxes from these countries, which gave them tremendous wealth, as well as slave labor. But as years went by, after Paul went ahead and formed the churches around the Roman Empire, in answer to the question that Mariana asked during the week, many different places that Paul had formed churches had their own versions of how they were teaching the message of Joshua. Paul tried to unite them so they all had one particular message or messages, and they were consistent. But because of the personalities of the people that were the administrators in the different places, and because they didn't have the methods we have today of communicating with one another, it was not unusual they would go off into their own tangents of teaching the message of Joshua. So eventually what happened as we approached the 4th century, you had about 5 or 6 different versions of what one would call Christianity being taught in the churches that originally were created by Paul. And the Roman Empire, in the early 4th century, as it was ruled by Constantine, who was the emperor, had many different religions, pagan religions, that they were practicing and giving honor to. Because there were so many different ethnic groups, and each one of the countries had their own backgrounds and their own history, what they believed in, as far as deities and believed in God, or what they considered to be higher deities and statues and they worshipped. And Constantine recognized that had 80 million people in the Roman Empire. And how do you control 80 million people from all these different ethnic backgrounds? And he thought to himself that if there was one common religion that existed among the entire Roman Empire, he would have much greater control over the 80 million people that made up the Roman Empire. And it was during the time that he was ready to enter battle in the year 312 that he was located on the Milvian Bridge, ready to cross the bridge with his army and go to the war, that he claimed that he looked up in the sky and saw a vision of the crucifix in the sky, and that this inspired him. And through that inspiration, he won the battle that he was in, and he met with his counselors and his his followers who helped him make decisions and said, you know what? If we could create one religion throughout the Roman Empire and give up all the pagan religions, I think we can control the lives of the people. And we won't do it through love, we'll do it through fear, because fear has a much greater control over the lives of people than love does. So they decided to go ahead and create the Roman Universal Church. Now the word universal in Latin is the word Catholic. The word Catholic means universal. It's a Latin word, Catholic. So they formed in reference to the religious decision to form the Roman Catholic Church. And as they looked at the 6 or 7 different sects or different versions of Catholicism that Christianity was being taught, they decided on the one that had only the 4 Gospels, the one we know today as the Roman Catholic Church. And they banned all the other churches that were teaching Christianity. They literally took the property and temples away from these people and gave it just to that one new church, which they called the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, they went one step further and they decided they would not place any taxes on those people who were the ones who were the administrators of the Roman Catholic Church. And they appointed their first pope. In fact, for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, the Roman government actually controlled the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and they appointed each one of the popes for the first 1,000 years. And the Roman Empire went all the way towards Constantinople. And just south of Constantinople, there was a beautiful little town called Nicaea. It was a suburb, so to speak, south of Constantinople. And they had the first ecumenical council of Constantinople in Nicaea, and that was in the year 325 AD. And that's when they made many, many decisions, which became part of the Roman Catholic Church even today. They went ahead and hired 25 scribes who they assigned the responsibility of translating the Gospels and all the writings of the New Testament from ancient Latin to what they called Vulgate Latin, which was contemporary Latin. You must remember that the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic. Aramaic was very much similar to Hebrew. If you could speak Aramaic, you could also speak Hebrew. The words they wrote went from right to left. They used no punctuation and no vowels. All the words were just equivalent of consonants. And they had no punctuation, and they went on and on and on for pages and pages. And the scribes had to figure out, when they translated from Aramaic into Greek, they had to figure out where the sentences ended. They also had to make many, many decisions as to what the words meant. So for a period of 20 years, these 25 scribes went ahead and translated the New Testament that was written in ancient Latin into contemporary Latin. And many, many changes were made. Some of the changes were unintentional, and some of them were intentionally done. Some of them were done with the direction of the church. Because one of the things the church wanted to make sure is that the Romans would never be held responsible for the death of Joshua. So, for example, they invented in 2 of the Gospels the version where the Sanhedrin, those 70 elderly Jewish men who ran the temples in the Judaic religion at the time of Joshua, had this trial in the middle of the night that Joshua was arrested, and claimed that they condemned him to death. And that was a false story. None of that happened. But again, they were very adamant to try to make sure that the blame was not on the Romans, but the responsibility for the death of Joshua be placed against the Jewish people. And they had to, so they had to insert certain things in the Gospels, the New Testament, in order to clear themselves of any responsibility and to be able to blame it on the Jews. And that's why in 2 of the 4 Gospels they have this story claiming that they met, that the Sanhedrin met and made that decision to ask Pontius Pilate to have Jeshua crucified. I tell the story in great detail in Time for Truth, so I'm not going to go into that right now. But what is important is the changes they made were very dramatic. Some of the decisions they had to make, for example, which were inadvertent, which weren't done intentionally, had to do with Jeshua. Jeshua was called spelling in English, N-A-G-G-A-H, a Nagar in the New Testament. And the word Nagar could be translated to mean only one of three things. It could mean either a wise man, it could mean a scholar, or it could mean a craftsman. Or the person that was doing that translation had to make a decision. What was Jeshua? Was he a scholar? Was he an educated man? Was he a craftsman? And in one of the translations, they called him a craftsman. So that's how the church came up with the concept that Jeshua was a carpenter, which was not true. He was never a carpenter. That, again, was caused of faulty translation. And the same is true of his mother, Mary. It was written in Greek before they translated it into Latin, that she was an Alma, spelled English-wise A-L-M-A-H. And the word Alma could mean either a young girl or a virgin. So many English words, so many words we have in English language can have more than one meaning. The assumption was that a girl who was a young girl back in that time was also a virgin. So the word Alma could be translated either way. And some places in the New Testament, in the Gospels, they decided that they would call her a virgin and created the virgin birth. Church argued about it for hundreds of years, whether or not there was a virgin birth, or whether people wouldn't believe it, and whether they shouldn't include that in the New Testament. But, very candidly, it doesn't make a difference for me, from my perspective. It doesn't change who Jeshua was. Jeshua was Jeshua, whether Mary had a virgin birth or not. It was something that was never discussed, and Jeshua never said his mother would have a virgin birth. And the same is true of the three Magi. When they had the three Magi supposedly follow a star at the time that Jeshua was born in Bethlehem, one could ask the question, if these three Magi, men of just tremendous wealth, followed the star and found that this incredible birth took place, would they then just turn around and go home? Or would they not have turned around and protected this child his entire life until he became an adult? So did the Magi actually, were there actually three Magi that followed a star to Bethlehem? It's highly unlikely, but again, I say to you, it doesn't make a difference because it doesn't change who Jeshua is or who Jeshua was. But these are some of the things that I think might have got incorporated into the New Testament, and just to give greater credibility in terms of what they were trying to create when they translated the New Testament from Greek to Latin and then eventually into Vulgate Latin during the 4th century. One of the things that troubled me very much in the translations is where they say that Paul persecuted the witnesses or the brotherhood. Following the death of Jeshua, and when they created their organization, sometimes they refer to as the witnesses, meaning that they witnessed the message of Jeshua's life when he was alive, and sometimes they were called the brotherhood. But it's stated in there, if you recall, that Paul persecuted the members of the brotherhood, and this was not true. Paul never. The word was criticized. Paul did criticize them, but in the course of making the translations from ancient Latin to contemporary Latin, they went ahead and said that Paul persecuted the followers of Jeshua. And Paul was not in a position to persecute anybody. He was not in a position of responsibility. He was a business person at the time that Jeshua was alive until he became an apostle. So that was one of the translations that bothered me deeply. Now the church had to make some major decisions. And one of the major decisions they had to make was, how do we control the lives of people? And one of the greatest ways to control them was by creating fear, creating a religion that created fear in people's hearts and souls, so they would be able to have control over the 80 million people hopefully the church felt as many that would be willing to accept Christianity as their religion. One of the ways they did that, of course, is by creating the concept of hell. Interesting enough that, as you already know from my previous discussions I've had with you from reading my book, hell was a dump outside of Jerusalem in the valley of Hinnom that burned 24 hours a day. In Hebrew, it's called Gehenna. For those of you that don't have the Hebrew language knowledge, the H is pronounced like a ches. It's called chesed. So Gehenna would have been pronounced Gehenna. In English, the word Gehenna means hell. Well, in the year 2000, in U.S. News, the headlines was, let me move it so I can get it on the tape. The headlines was, in the year 2000, a new vision of the netherworld. And there's an article. Guess what page it's on? It's on page 44. Strangely enough. And the article is Hell Hath No Fury. And it's about a 5-page article where it tells how Pope John Paul went before the leaders of the Vatican and said to them, we have to stop preaching hell. We're now in the 20th century, and we're losing thousands and thousands of people every year who are quitting the church. And there's no such place as hell. What hell is, it's an attitude that people have who are living their lives not according to God's will. And in this article, they show that a poll was taken at that time in which 64% of the population of the United States believed in hell, 25% didn't, and 9% said they don't know. But 64% of the people believed in hell. And the Pope said, we have to tell people there is no such place as hell. Hell is an attitude for people who are not living their life embracing God's wishes. And the leaders in the Vatican said, no, we can't do that. We need hell in order to keep the sinners in fear, to keep the sinners in fear of God. As incredible as this was, that this should appear as a front-page story in a magazine of U.S. News and World on January 31st edition, the year 2000, it never got picked up any other place. It was never discussed in the media, never discussed on television. And I can remember asking a couple of priests that I would run into occasionally, well, what do you think about the fact that the Pope acknowledged, it was in a front page story in an article in a newspaper, a magazine, in U.S. News and World Report, that there is no such place as hell. And they sort of looked at me and said, you must be reading the article wrong. That was never said. So that was the end of the Pope's effort to try to get people, the Church, the Vatican, to change their position on the word hell and the concept of hell. In the Old Testament, they never talked about hell. There was no hell in the Old Testament. The Jewish people don't believe in hell, just as Jewish people don't believe in the devil. At the time of Joshua, there were three main sects of Judaic religion. There was the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Pharisees believed in reincarnation, and they represented the majority of the Jewish people living at that time. The Sadducees said that we don't know what happens after death. Only God knows what happens after death. And the Essenes, which were a small portion of the population, they believed in reincarnation also. The Judaic religion today, the majority of the Judaic religion, I'd say 95% of them, still to this day believe what the Sadducees, saying we don't know what happens after death, only God knows. So Judaic religion, even today, does not believe in hell. There's a small segment of Judaic religion that do believe in reincarnation, and those are the people that are called Hasidic Jews, the ones that have the long curls and black hair, they dress in black all the time and they wear black hats. They go back to 2,000 years ago in the belief in reincarnation, but they represent just a very small portion, percentage-wise, Judaic people. But the important part of what I'm saying is that in the Old Testament, You'll never find the Judaic people talking about hell or the devil because they didn't believe in the devil or hell. And that was something invented by the church in the 4th century in order to create fear in people, in order to control the lives of people. As a matter of fact, in the Old Testament, the word Satan was referred to as a type of angel. Do you recall in Job, supposedly God and Satan, the angel Satan angel was having a conversation about Job and his family, and the Satan angel was saying to God, let's test Job. Let's bring him calamities in his life and see if he still believes in you, if he still has love and respect for you. And the story goes on how Job had these different calamities happen to him. It was all done as a result of the conversation that the Satan angel was having with God. And in the part of Numbers in the Old Testament, there's a man by the name of Balaam, and he's riding on a donkey, and he's going to visit with the enemies of Israel, of the Jews, Israel, to tell them where the Jews are located. And God says, according to Numbers, that God sends a Satan angel to stand in front of the donkey and not allow the donkey to pass on this narrow road. Now, obviously, it's just a story. There's no truth to the story that a Satan angel was sent down in front of the donkey, not allowing the donkey to pass on the road. But the point was that even in the Old Testament, Satan was referred to a type of angel that God would use to send on certain messages or certain errands. It was not considered something that was evil. It was an invention of the church in the 4th century in order to create fear in people. And the reason the church wanted people to not believe in reincarnation, and they purged everything dealing with the reincarnation out of the New Testament. They tried to. Because they wanted people to believe that we only had one lifetime to live. And that salvation and redemption can only come through the church. Because if you had your own relationship with God through reincarnation, and that you believed that the Spirit of God was inside of you and you were eternal and immortal, this would tremendously lessen the importance of the church and the Roman Catholic Church in your life. And that's why the church did not want to have people believe in reincarnation. Many of the church leaders in the first several centuries of the existence of the Roman Catholic Church believed in reincarnation. And in one of the future sessions we'll have like this, I'll confine it strictly to reincarnation and give you specific quotes of some of the members of the leaders of the church back 2,000 years ago, what they had to say about reincarnation to prove that indeed it was an absolute part of the teachings. Now, one of the things that's interesting, Origen, O-R-I-G-E-N, was one of the leaders of the church. He was one of the great intellectuals of the church in the early part of the formation of the Roman Catholic Church. And he wrote the following. He was talking about the changes that were being made in the translations of the Gospels, of the New Testament, from ancient Latin to contemporary Latin. And he says, quote, "The differences among the manuscripts have become great, either through the negligence of some of the copyists or through the perverse audacity of others. They either neglect to check over what they have transcribed, or in the process of checking, they make many additions or deletions as they please." Now that was written by Origen, one of the leaders of the church, one of the great intellectuals at that time, in the fourth century, that he was observing these changes being made, and that they were making major changes in the Gospels. He even went on to say that they're making changes in the letters of Paul, removing some of the many points that Paul was making in terms of the messages of Jeshua. One of the questions I was asked, I think, during the week is that were there any writings still in existence in the church archives that talk about the relation of Jeshua and Paul, which were omitted in the New Testament? And I'm sure there are. We'll probably never get to see them, but I'm sure there are. What are some of the other things that the church did in order to control the lives of people through fear? Well, one of the things they did was to create the concept that every child born in the earth was condemned by God to go to hell because of original sin. And only through the church baptism could a child be saved and not go to hell. I know I've mentioned this in great detail in one of my previous presentations I gave you when I was answering questions that you wrote in, so I'm not going to go into that again. But let me point out the following that I think is very important, which has to do a little bit about reincarnation. I mentioned to you they tried to purge everything dealing with reincarnation out of the New Testament, and they missed it. One of the places they missed it was in Matthew 16, verse 13. It's written in the very last chapter of the Old Testament, in Malachi, that the prophet Elijah would be born again someday in the future in order to allow the world to know that the Messiah was on earth, the anointed one, the Christ, was born on earth. It's actually written in the last chapter of Malachi that Elijah would be born again, Elijah who was a great prophet that probably went back 700 years earlier than the time of Malachi. So in the New Testament, in Matthew, Joshua meets his disciples along the Sea of Galilee on the northeastern shore of Galilee, and he says to them, he asks them, he says, who are people saying that I am? And his disciples answer him and say that, well, some are saying that you were he who was the prophet Elijah. In other words, the person that was going to be born, according to the prophet Malachi, that was going to bring in the Messiah. And Joshua says, no. He says, he who was Malachi has already come, and he took his life, just as surely someday he'll take mine also. And then it goes on to say, in the next couple of paragraphs, the disciples knew that he was talking about that John the Baptist was a reincarnation of the prophet Elijah, who had come to show the way, to tell them of the coming of the Messiah. And if you recall, John the Baptist was the cousin of Joshua. He was about 2 years older than Joshua. His mother Elizabeth was a sister of Mary, the mother Mary. And John the Baptist was born very late in life to his mother. In fact, there's a scene, if you recall, in my book, The Commitment, where John is preaching along the Dead Sea to people who are along the shoreline, and he's approached, and Joshua has just finished a 2-hour walk with Paul and Mary Magdalene and three of the disciples, and they come across a scene of John preaching to these people sitting along the shore and baptizing them one at a time. And finally he looks up at Joshua and beckons Joshua forward. And Joshua walks in the water, wades in the water, approaching John. And John yells out to the people, "It is my responsibility to show you the way. And this man is the way," referring to Joshua, which is consistent with the fact that he was a reincarnation of the prophet Elijah, who was to show the people the way, was to introduce the people to the Messiah. And if you recall what happens in the commitment, when Joshua reaches John, rather than John baptizing Joshua takes John by the shoulders and very gently moves him backwards so that his head's below the water, and Joshua baptizes John instead. One of the questions I was asked during the week by Noel, he asked me, how did I write the commitment? Was I in a trance? Was I channeling it? For somehow, some gift I was given is I have the ability to tap into my soul mind. I literally have the ability, since I had that regression back before the Messages was written, with Julia Ingram, where I spent 6 months under hypnosis and experienced the memory of Paul in hypnosis. I was given the gift of being able to tap into my soul mind by putting my conscious mind aside and literally having the memory of Paul. And when I was writing the commitment, you might say in essence that I wasn't writing it, Paul was writing it. Because I literally was writing it for the memory of Paul. And I just got finished reading it just this last few days. I finished reading the last chapter just several days ago. And as I was reading it, I realized I wrote it in style of English, almost like I was, without using colloquialisms that I use today as Nick Bunick, because I was writing it as if Paul was writing it, as Paul was using it, as if he spoke English, but without using American colloquialisms we use today. And I love that book, The Commitment. I really and truly felt like I was reliving the scenes myself as I was reading the book, which I just reread again the last 30 days. But to answer your question, Noel, I was given the gift of, I have that gift of being able to tap into the soul mind, my soul mind, and be able to think and visualize and see things through the memory of Paul. And that's how I was able to do the portrait of Joshua, was through my soul memory of Paul. One of the important aspects of what happened with the church has to do with women. Half of the people that Paul had appointed as his administrators of his church were women. And as he wrote about them in his letters, and as he commended them and spoke highly of his women followers who administrated the church, one of the things that the church did in the 4th century, they changed the women's names to men's names because they did not want to acknowledge the role that women played in the life of Joshua and in the life of Paul and in the early creation of the church, the important role they played as administrators of the church. That's also the reason why I believe they took the word disciples, which is a Greek word from the word disciples, which means pupils, and instead claimed in the Gospels that there were only 12 disciples, leading you to believe that these were 12 men who were specifically selected to be special in Joshua's life, rather than telling you that the word disciples meant pupils, because then you would know, of course, that Joshua didn't have just 12 pupils. He had thousands of pupils, and half of them were women. But the way the church could deny women that position of responsibility and the role they played in Joshua's life and Paul's life is by claiming that Joshua had just 12 pupils, and that the word pupils, they gave the name disciples. The other thing that happened was that when Paul had appointed Lucius, the head of the church of Laodicea, Lucius was married to a Jewish woman named Maria, and he had an affair with a Roman woman who was married also, by the name of Vesta, and had a child by her. And Paul made a decision at that time, because of the scandal that was created, that he had to remove Lucius from his position of responsibility. And he made some decisions at that time regarding the administrators of his church had to be, if they were married, they had to be loyal to their spouse. If they weren't married, he didn't want them to have an affair with the local women. When the church adopted some of Paul's administrative regulations in the 4th century, they went one step further, of course, many steps further, in claiming that Paul also said that the clergy members, administrative church, had to be celibate, couldn't be married, and had to be celibate, which is not what Paul said. Paul said they could be married, but he wants them to have faithful relationship with their wives, and if they weren't married, he didn't want them to get involved romantically with the local women. But he was talking about both as men and women administrators. And the leaders of the church changed that to say that not only did the priests have to be celibate, but only that Paul had chosen that only men could be members of the administrators' church, which was not true. So the two ways that they're able to show bias against women holding positions of responsibility in the church is by claiming that they could not become a member of the clergy other than a nun and hold positions of responsibility within the church if they were women, because it was just a good old boys club just for the men, which is very unfortunate because this is denying the right of hundreds of thousands of women throughout the centuries who were devoted women that could have made incredible members of the church as priests and bishops and cardinals. Instead were denied this capability. One of the people that I have a friendship with who is European told me while I was writing when I was writing Time for Truth, she was one of the 6 people that were acting as my private editor, so to speak, and commenting. I would send them a chapter by chapter as I wrote Time for Truth. And she told me that in Europe, they are located in different places, a convent, and maybe 50 yards away from the convent, there's a monastery, which of course the monastery was occupied and inhabited strictly by men, and the convent by nuns. And what they found during the 20th century, or let's say in the 1900s, during a space of land that was undeveloped, located between the convents and the monasteries, when they dug them up in order to put in foundations for buildings, they would find the bones of hundreds and hundreds of little babies that had been born and were killed and buried in that space between the convent and the monasteries, which were the result of hundreds of years of relationship of the nuns becoming pregnant from according to common sense, becoming pregnant from the priests, and when the child was born, they went ahead and just did not allow the child to live, and the child ended up being buried there. This is very sad, these stories, and it breaks my heart to think about that and think about these what celibacy has caused in the church in terms of attracting pedophile priests, pedophile men who became priests. This didn't just happen during the 1900s. This has been going on for the last 1,600 years. The abuse of young boys by priests men who became members of the church that should never have been allowed to become members of the church, who were pedophiles. And this wouldn't have happened if the church had not created the false requirement of celibacy among its priests. It's time for truth. There are thousands of churches that have been closed over the last few years. Membership in the church is tremendously down. The United States, only about 32% of Catholics attend Mass. In other parts of the world, it's even less. I think in France, it's only about 15% of Catholics attend Mass. In Germany, perhaps around 20%. And these churches are closing down because people no longer want to hear about they're going to go to hell if God's going to punish them if they don't follow the strict rules and regulations of the church, or the devil is going to get them and influence their lives, or they were born sinners, or that Joshua died on the cross because of their sinning, so Joshua could forgive them, and that's why he died on the cross. And it's caused a great conflict of people who believe in the church in so many other ways, who are dedicated Catholics, but yet they can no longer continue to accept some of the teachings of the church which are not true, which are false teachings. And this is why I wrote Time for Truth. It's not to hurt the church. I can recall the day I sat at my desk and I wrote the letters. I wrote it in my own handwriting, and I wrote to my spirit guides. I said, if I were to write this book, Time for Truth, are you asking, isn't it going to hurt the church? Are you asking me to hurt the church? And about 5 minutes later, I picked up my pencil and they had me write no to save the church. I don't know if the church is savable. I know that one of the things, many things the church has to change in their teachings to be savable in order for the church to survive over the next 20 years is to allow women to become priests. And to allow all priests, both men and women, to allow them to be married and to have families, as opposed to having the present system of celibacy. Because there's so many people who are dedicated, who make such wonderful priests and members of the clergy and hold positions of responsibility within the church. If they change those teachings and acknowledge the truth that they were never supposed to have been part of the church. And the church did that in order just to control who was to become the members of the church and the leaders in the church. The church can play a very, very important part in the world. There are 1.6 billion people who are born Catholic, of the 6 billion people in the world. If you add the other segments of the sects of the Christian religion, you're talking about 2 billion people, of 6 billion people. That's 1/3 of the population of the world. But it's so important for the church to change its teachings, to get people to embrace universal love and universal compassion. In the new book that is being channeled to me, that I'm writing maybe a quarter of a chapter, or half a chapter every couple of days because it's so profound the information they're giving me. But they're telling me, the source that's channeling this information to me, is that the future is going to be a new church, which they refer to as the Great Tomorrow, which, as you know, is the name of my foundation. They keep referring to it as the Great Tomorrow, the teachings of the Great Tomorrow. There will be a church which will be a spin-off, so to speak, of Catholicism, a spin-off of all the religions, one in which people will incorporate the true teachings of Joshua and Paul of 2,000 years ago. And much of the wisdom has been lost over the years and set aside. And that'll all be incorporated in the Great Tomorrow, which will be the religion of the future. And there will be temples and there will be priests or administrators of the church. And it will be a spin-off of the religions that exist today. But it will be a universal religion that all people from all over the world, from all the different countries, all the different nations, all the different races, will have these common teachings of tolerance and brotherly love and compassion. And there will no longer be hungry children in the world, because we'll recognize every child is a child of God, and that every one of us are brothers and sisters, regardless of our ethnic background, regardless of the color of skin, regardless of where geographically we live in the world. This is what the future holds. But the church can play such an important part right now in sharing the truth with people. And it's so hard for me I try not to get emotional about it, and I don't want to be angry when I talk about this, and I only wish I could have the people who concerned Catholics around the world, concerned members of positions of responsibility within the Vatican, within the church, say, what I'm trying to share is not to hurt the church, but just that it's time for truth. It's time for the church just to acknowledge the tremendous teachings that are incorporated in the church, which were put in there in the 4th century, were not part of the teachings of Joshua and Paul. And allowed the church to play the important role in the lives of people that was intended to play. It makes such a tremendous difference in the world. We wouldn't have the hostility going on. Look at right now what's happening across the world. The embassies, American embassies being attacked, all the Muslims world. Of course it's a part of religion. It's a part of the religious differences and the religious animosities existing. That has existed for centuries now between those of the Muslim faith and those of the Christian faith. And that should change. It shouldn't be there. I honestly believe if the church leaders would ever acknowledge the truth and change many of their teachings, that rather than people being offended and say, how could you have lied to us for 1,600 years, that they would embrace the leaders of the church with admiration and respect for having the courage to tell the truth. And instead of only 30% of the Catholics attending church in the United States and only 15% in France and other parts of the world, the churches would be filled again and have to reopen the old churches or build new churches because of new teachings that would be ones of universal love and universal compassion that would not incorporate the fear of God and the false concepts of hell and the false concepts of the devil, and that Joshua died on the cross because we're all sinners, and we're responsible for his death because he died to have our sins forgiven, as well as the concept of original sin, that a child was born condemned by God to go to hell. I want you all to be part of the great tomorrow. When people tell you that you're wrong, that your teachings are wrong, ask them 2 questions. Say to them, I'll ask you just 2 questions about your religion that are questions that are so easy to answer and so simple that we'll see whether or not you have the true teachings of the church. First question I want to ask you is, why isn't the New Testament that only Mary Magdalene has a last name? How come Joshua doesn't have a last name? Well, none of the disciples or apostles have a last name, and only Mary Magdalene have a last name. And they'll look at you in puzzlement and so say, well, that was her last name. And you can say, no. The truth is, the reason she was called Mary Magdalene because she was a Magdalene. She was from Magdala. She was from the city of Magdala, the town of Magdala, which was along the seacoast, along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's called Magdala. And people from Magdala were called Magdalenes. Just like people from Boston are called Bostonians. And people from San Francisco are called San Franciscans. So she was originally called Mary the Magdalene, and the church in the New Testament left out the word the, and they call her Mary Magdalene. And they say, oh. And the second question you could ask them is that, what I talked about earlier, how many disciples did Joshua have? And they would look at you like you're insane. If you know a priest, ask a priest like this. Say, well, of course everybody knows that Joshua had 12 disciples. And you can say, really? So are you aware of the fact that the word disciples comes from the ancient Greek word disciples, which means pupils? Do you think Joshua only had 12 pupils? Didn't he preach to 500 people along the Sea of Galilee? The Sermon on the Mount, where he took a basket of bread and fish and had it pass out and fed 500 people. There were 500 people there, according to the New Testament, just in the Sermon on the Mount. That were his pupils. So how could Joshua have only had 12 disciples when he had 500 just in the Sermon on the Mount that were his pupils? The reason I share that with you, it can just possibly make those people with closed minds begin to wonder, well, you know what? If something as simple as the name of Mary Magdalene and how many disciples Joshua had is inaccurate in the New Testament, isn't it possible there are many other things in the New Testament that aren't accurate? And hopefully that can open up a dialogue between you and these people, not to criticize the church, but just to make the people realize that many of the teachings in the church need to be refined. We've got to go back to the original teachings of Joshua and Paul 2,000 years ago, including the incorporation of the understanding of reincarnation and the important role that reincarnation plays in the importance of people's lives. How the purpose of every one of us is to evolve spiritually, to evolve in our spirituality, to eventually every one of us have a relationship with that part of God inside of us, that we're at one with that part of God in Christ's consciousness that we have inside of us. And it can't be done without reincarnation. Only through reincarnation can we live, can we be reborn, our spirits and soul are eternal. Can we become at one? As many lifetimes it takes us to purify our spirits and soul in order to become at one with God and Christ consciousness. Ask those people. Third question is that when a 4-year-old child is in an accident, or a 2-year-old child is in an accident and has a transition of soul, whether it's a car accident or whether the child dies from disease, why would God want a 2-year-old child to die of a disease without the child having been able to live its life, being able to learn the distinguishment between right and wrong, and earn its place in heaven next to God, based on the Christian concept, Christian teachings? Well, the reason being is because, in reality, reincarnation gives that child's spirit and soul to be born again. Since a child's death, or any person's death, is just one chapter of a book that has hundreds and hundreds of chapters in it, each chapter representing one of our lifetimes. Church teaches when a child dies, the child goes to limbo. Limbo is supposedly someplace between neither heaven or hell, but where a child goes to because a child hasn't earned its right. You have to go into heaven. Well, can you imagine the millions and millions and millions of little babies that must be in limbo? Would you like to have that diaper concession limbo for those millions of babies? I mean, it's so ludicrous that in a very gentle, sweet, loving way, you could ask your friends that have their closed minds towards the true teachings of Christianity as it should have been, saying, how can you accept the concept of limbo? The little baby is going to stay in limbo to eternity, as opposed to that child having the right to be born again, and the experience of born again, that beautiful soul and spirit of that child being born again into a new child, a new baby, in order to experience the lessons we have in learning in life and the ability to ascend further and evolve, becoming closer at one with God and Christ consciousness. There are so many different aspects of, so many different questions you could ask that are just common sense questions. I don't care if you're asking it of a priest. I would love to be able to have a discussion with the Pope. I'd love to be able to have you call it a debate you want. I'd love to go on international television and pose these questions to the Pope. Not to embarrass him. Just hopefully be able to look into his own heart, his own mind, and realize that it doesn't make sense. And it's time to tell the truth. It's time for truth in order to have people understand their true relationship with God, and that we're all brothers and sisters. And there is no such thing as hell and the devil and that we're born in sin. It's time to take Jesus off of the cross and to celebrate his life and his teachings rather than his death. Well, in a future session with you, I'd like to be able to confine it strictly to reincarnation. Reincarnation plays such an important part in our lives because it is the journey we're on. And it's through reincarnation that God has given us the gift that our spirit and soul is immortal. And we can be incarnated again in order to continue on our journey and climb up that pyramid of 1,000 steps to become one with God in Christ consciousness. Because it can't be done in one lifetime. We all make mistakes in our lives. I have my share of mistakes I've made in my life that I'm trying during this lifetime while I'm still here to rectify and to cleanse my soul, which is something we did together, many of us last week when we had a session on forgiveness. But it's to understand our relationship with God and be able to get in touch with that part of God inside of us that is so important that takes more than one lifetime to accomplish. So, in talking to your friends who are Christians and who have a closed mind over what we are teaching on our website, what we are practicing on our website, which I've tried to teach in my books, or you can look up on Google. Maybe you can get a copy out of Google of this U.S. News and World Report front story that was written in January 31st of 2000 on page 44, a 5-page article where the Pope is trying to persuade the members of the Vatican to stop teaching the concept of hell. And it's not the concept of hell that is so important. It's just part of a picture. It's part of something bigger, which is the acknowledgement of the true teachings of St. Paul. Well, I look forward to that day when the true teachings are taught, whether it's a spin-off of a new religion, which is the Great Tomorrow, which incorporates all the different races and all the different religions in the world into one universal religious belief, which is spirituality, which is filled with spirituality. Spirituality plays such an important role rather than dogmas and rituals. Well, I've been talking to you about an hour now, and there's so many more things I want to share with you, but I honestly think it's important that I save some of these thoughts for a future day. Sarah did call me earlier today. She was on a flight. She was coming from a flight from Los Angeles, where she'd been away on child health business. And she was coming back to Arizona today. So next Sunday, Sarah and I will be with you at 44 minutes past the hour. We'll do our healing show, our Miracles and Healing show, next Sunday at 44 minutes past the hour. So I want to thank you so much for the time you spent with us today. My voice is a little hoarse, and I have to tell you why it's hoarse. Over the weekend, my son played in this football game, and they're undefeated, and they were playing a team that was a wonderful, wonderful team. It was a home game. And we were ahead by 1 touchdown in the fourth quarter by 6 points. And the team had the ball. The other team had the ball on our 12-yard line. And I don't know if you can see this or not. Let's see. Right above my finger, that's my son. No, that's not the right picture. I'm sorry. Anyway, my son has accepted a pass in the end zone covering a guy that was 6 feet 3 inches tall. My son's 5'10", intercepted a pass and saved the game. And he brought great joy to me in the process of doing that. It made all the headlines and all the newspapers. A picture of him leaping up in the air in front of the 6'3" guy, intercepting the pass in the end zone. So I voiced his horse today from all the celebrating and yelling I did at the football game, which we ended up winning, staying undefeated. So forgive my hoarseness, which is a good cause. Thank you so much for joining me today. God bless every one of you. I love you. Bye.